Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Since we have a rather small group, we had a different format of meeting this morning. It's cozy and it's nice this way. We have a very special guest speaker with a very familiar but haunting subject, and that is the Eurozone crisis. The speaker is Nicolas Veron, who is senior fellow at Peterson Institute, as well as the Bruegel Institute in Brussels. He's senior fellow there as well. At the same time, actually, he was the one who led the initiative of establishing Bruegel Institute, which is a leading think tank in economic policy area in Europe. And so Bruegel is very busy nowadays dealing with this Eurozone crisis. In fact, the Nicolas Veron was named one of the top 10 most influential thinkers by Bloomberg Market Magazine this year. I think he was credited for advocating the European banking union and the banking integration from the very early stage, and that is why I think the Bloombergs recognize him as one of the top thinkers of our time, who has particular influence in the markets. He wrote many academic articles and papers. At the same time, he got involved in advising the government cabinet members, and at the same time he worked in the private sector as well. So he has a wide range of experience, and particularly since he got involved in the Eurozone issues, I'm sure that he will tell us what's going on there and the outlook of the European Union and the current ongoing crisis. With this, let me invite Nicolas, please. Please.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sakong, for your kind introduction. I think all of you are familiar with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Bruegel is a more recent and smaller organization. You mentioned that I participated in its creation, but I was not alone, or even I suspect the main one. So some of you might be familiar with Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is the director and founding director of Bruegel, as well as Mario Monti, who is now the Prime Minister of Italy, but was our founding chairman, and therefore is a very important figure in the creation of this organization. I'm sure that most of you have heard many presentations about the Eurozone crisis, and the special feature of this crisis is that it never ends. It is with us. It has been with us for a very long time already, and thus I will try to update some of the elements that you are already familiar with. So the crisis has a long genealogy, and I think now there is a bit more acknowledgement in the European policy community of where it comes from, but we're still very far from a consensus. There's a long quote here, which is probably too small for you to read anyway, but which is by Jean Monnet, who was by many aspects the intellectual father and practical father also to a large extent of the European Union as we know it now. And when he was very old, in the mid-1970s, he wrote his memoirs. And what he writes here, which I won't read entirely, but is that the European institutions are incomplete. They are a quasi-federal model, but they're not the European Commission, the Council, the Parliament, the Court of Justice, are not the organs of a political federation of Europe that will eventually arise from a specific creative action that will require a new delegation of sovereignty. So when you read this quote, which is almost 40 years old, it really feels like he had seen that there would be a crisis like the one we have now, which not only need addressing and decisive action from politicians and policymakers, but also some rethinking of the institutions of the European Union, because they're not strong enough, and they're also not democratic enough to withstand the shocks brought forward by economic integration. And I think this was quite visionary and exactly corresponds to the situation we're now in. So when the euro was introduced in the early 1990s, it was introduced, as was well analyzed by many people at the time, with an incomplete policy framework. We had reasons for this. The euro was a response by politicians, it was a political response primarily, to the dominance of the Bundesbank in monetary policy making in Europe in the 1980s, and it was a response to the reunification of Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. At the time, the leaders were not able to find a consensus on banking supervision. They were not able to find a strong binding framework for fiscal policy. They were not able to bring the political integration of European institutions forward to the extent that would have been necessary to sustain a strong monetary union. And the striking thing is that many people were aware of these shortcomings at the time, but still they went forward because they felt that was the only way to make progress. Also, many decisions of admitting members into the European Union were too lax. It's obvious with hindsight in the case of Greece, maybe a few other member states. So this is also part of what has been creating this crisis if we look a bit farther back in the past. In the 2000s, there has been also a lot of complacency. The Stability and Growth Pact, which was supposed to ensure some fiscal discipline, was flouted not by the periphery countries, but actually by the two most central countries of the Eurozone, France and Germany, in the mid-2000s. There was a tremendous divergence of competitiveness between the north and the south of Europe, especially in the late 2000s. I'm sure you have seen many presentations of these data. And there was unchecked credit expansion, a real estate bubble in some member states, massive bank leveraging in all member states, and this combined with a very strong remaining financial nationalism, each member state promoting or helping its own national champions in the financial and banking industry, which led to an imbalanced and not genuinely integrated financial system. And this helps understand the crisis we're in. I won't go through all the history and chronology of the crisis because I suspect that you are quite familiar with it, but I will present what I think is an appropriate analytical framework at this point of the situation in the Eurozone to analyze what are the problems and what needs to be done. So here I'm very much aligned with the report that Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, the permanent president of the European Council, presented in June, and which was, I think, the first time in the official policymaking community of the Eurozone that the crisis was described not just as a fiscal problem in some periphery member states, but as something much more complex and much bigger. So the way I would suggest thinking about it is that there are four major dimensions along with along which stakeholders have lost trust in the way the European Union, and particularly the Eurozone, is functioning. The first one is the financial system. With a dysfunctional interbank market, banks have stopped to lend to each other the way they used to, and this, of course, has to be met by decisive action to restore normal credit conditions, and at this point, this is the agenda of the European Banking Union, which Chairman Sakong has briefly referred to in his introduction. The second loss of trust, obviously, is on the fiscal situation of some European member states, and here, basically, the investor community has lost the previous belief that these securities were free of credit risk, so they are no longer arm's length international buyers for government debt securities of countries in the southern European periphery, and the aim is to find a new base of buyers for securities that might fund those governments' operations. Of course, you will not repair what has been broken, which means that the market for government debt securities will not be the same in terms of credit risk perceptions as it was before the crisis. And therefore, there is an increasingly strong feeling, I think, in the European policy communities that some form of jointly issued securities will be necessary, and this is what I would put under the label of fiscal union. The third loss of trust is in the ability of European countries to grow, and particularly some European countries, here again, those in the southern periphery first come to mind. So the economies are too sclerotic. The firms that have growth potential don't fulfill their potential. The aim has to be to enable them to fulfill their growth potential. And you might say this could take the form of some coordination of structural reform and structural policies, which is one way to think about an economic union that would complement the monetary union. This is a bit of a fuzzy concept, which is why I put a question mark here. And the fourth loss of trust, which in a way lurks above all the rest of the scene, is in the very ability of the European policymaker community to make the right decisions at the right time. There has been a lot of policy paralysis in the past 4 or 5 years in Europe. Here the aim should be to have institutions which of course are legitimate, but perhaps primarily are effective, are able to make the executive decisions, including the painful ones which the situation requires, and I think this is what many people put under the label of political union. So this is a hugely demanding and complex agenda, a fourfold agenda with those 4 dimensions, each of them very contentious, very controversial. And the fact that there has been so much trust lost around the European Union in the past few years results, of course, in the biggest worry of all, which is the breakup of the Eurozone, what the current jargon calls the redenomination risk, if the financial assets and liabilities of some member states would be redenominated in a national currency in case those member states would leave the euro area. And this is perhaps the biggest challenge that is that the Eurozone is confronted with some reduction in that worry in the past few weeks, and I will come back to this given the action of the European Central Bank and some political developments, but I don't think the risk of breakup has disappeared at all. It will just take new forms in a revised timetable. So to resolve this crisis successfully and ensure the sustainability of the euro, what makes it so difficult is that progress is needed in parallel on all those 4 fronts, banking, fiscal, economic and structural, and political and institutional. And this makes it extremely difficult, as we have seen. It is not possible to take one of those dimensions as a substitute for the others. There has been a temptation, for example, in the past few months, for some policymakers to think that we could get away with just a banking union and it would not be necessary to have deepening of the integration in the fiscal space or in the political space. I think this is delusional. What is needed is progress along the 4 dimensions, and none of them can be achieved in just one step. So we have a very iterative, very long process process, which will take a lot of time. And I'm sure we'll come back to this question of the overall timetable, but that makes it a hugely complex endeavor, not only technically, not only financially, but also politically and socially for all the member states involved. So compounding the difficulty, of course, as in any systemic crisis, is complex interaction between short-term and long-term challenges. And in the short term, there have been many steps of crisis management, and most of those steps, which I'm sure you are mostly familiar with, have been decisions made in a rush at the last minute by member states which felt they had no other choice. The banking system was fragile from the very start of the subprime crisis. So in 2007, 2009, we had a shock, a financial shock of similar dimensions, similar magnitude as the ones that hit the US at the time. But the US was able essentially to resolve their financial crisis at the scale of the US financial system in 2009, while Europe hasn't really engaged in crisis resolution yet. So we have had a difficulty to address this component of crisis management. And in late 2009, early 2010, we had the start of the fiscal difficulties in Greece, and this was also met with very late action, which was not really decisive. There was no decision to restructure the Greek debt really until earlier this year and to a very partial extent. But at the same time, the assistance, the financial support that was given to the Greek government was half-hearted and limited in a way that has not been successful at preventing contagion. Contagion has been actually increased by the recourse to private sector involvement solutions announced at a summit of France and Germany in Deauville in October 2010. And then moral hazard in the Eurozone had been compounded, particularly, I think, by the decisions at the time of the Irish assistance package in November 2010 to protect all creditors of Irish banks, even those that were found to be bankrupt, except some very junior subordinated creditors. And this has led to a worsening, I think, of the moral hazard in the European banking system. So now we have new steps taken in 2012. We started the year with a long-term refinancing operations over 3 years by the ECB, which stabilized the situations in the banking sector somewhat. Then we had the announcement in June 2012 that the European Stability Mechanism, the new fund that has been established by the Eurozone member states, would be able to recapitalize banks directly. This is not yet implemented. And it should be on the slide. Of course, the ECB has created its new program of outright monetary transactions, which has had tremendous market effect. And here the pattern has always been that the ECB, the European Central Bank, has been the default crisis manager when politicians have not been able to make the right decisions at the right time. So it is, of course, good because it has prevented the crisis from being even worse, but it has also created a feeling of moral hazard in the political community and of complacency that the ECB would always save the day if the decisions were not made by elected politicians. So we had all these short-term developments, but at the same time the challenge of a long-term transformation of European institutions and a challenge of representation, legitimacy and accountability at the European level, without which it is very difficult to make the decisions that are required. And in a way, the policy paralysis which I have referred to is just the flip side of the shortcomings of the accountability framework in Europe. So here we're talking about the capability for not only decisions but also implementation and the right checks and balances on executive decision making. And I think if you look at the sequence of the past 3-4 years, it is clear that we don't have a functioning framework for this. Each European member state has a democratically elected government that has these checks and balances and capacity to act. But if you take them collectively in the Eurozone or in the European Union, the corresponding characteristics are not there. Also, there is a challenge of financial resources at the Eurozone level that is obvious. Right now we have the newly established European Stability Mechanism, but it's very limited in size, and it puts a cap on the financial credibility of the actions that is taken in that space. And we have the long-standing challenge of what exactly is the geographical perimeter we're talking about. We have 27 countries in the European Union, 17 countries in the Eurozone, and in between we have a number of very important countries which might participate in some initiatives, including the banking union, but might not participate in the full monetary union, and that makes a number of decision-making processes much more complex as well. So let me go briefly through the different components that I have outlined in my previous slide. The banking union is a response to long-standing calls for banking policy integration. I think the IMF is among those who have called for the integration of banking policy as a necessary complement to the single market policy and the monetary union in Europe for a very long time. But I think what really triggered the recent initiatives in this space is the acknowledgement by policymakers of what many commentators have called the doom loop between sovereign credit and banking credit in individual member states. So because there are government guarantees of banking systems, if the banking systems has big problems, then the sovereign credit of the government is affected. Conversely, because banks have huge portfolios of home country government debt, if the government has a deterioration of its credit perception, then the banks suffer a lot as a consequence. And all this is compounded by financial repression or financial fragmentation in the Eurozone geographical perimeter. The European Central Bank in particular has published very compelling evidence in the past few months of the fact that this trend towards financial fragmentation and differentiation of credit conditions across the different countries of the Eurozone is happening in a very dramatic way right now as we speak. So the policy response has been a sequence of 3 steps implied by the decisions by the heads of state and government at their summit of June 29 and reaffirmed at the summit on October 18, so a couple of days ago, in terms of the general framework for this banking union. In the first step, there would be the establishment of what the jargon calls a single supervisory mechanism, which will be centralized by the European Central Bank. The second step would be the possibility of actual intervention by the European level through recapitalization of individual banks by the European Stability Mechanism. And then a third step in the more distant future would be a single resolution authority and deposit insurance. You may question the rationality of this sequence. In a way, it would have been perhaps sensible to do it exactly the other way around, to have first a resolution framework, then an intervention of the ESM that would be framed by this single resolution framework, and then a gradual build-up of something that is less necessary in the short term but crucial in the longer term, which is a single integrated capability for banking supervision. But that's the way it has been decided, and this is a reflection, I think, of the very complex political constraints that frames the decision-making of the European leaders at this point. Political constraints which are framed by the interaction of the different member states, but also and perhaps primarily by what happens in each individual member state in their individual political context. The first step, which is the single supervisory mechanism, will be created by new legislation, which is called in the European jargon a regulation of the Council. And the aim is to reach agreement on the text of this regulation by January 1st of 2013, being understood that then the operational implementation of this new regulation would take at least a couple of months. I'm sure we'll come back to this challenge in the Q&A. I think also it's important including when you compare with the situation in Korea or other parts of Asia, to think of what that means for the European financial system in terms of structural change going forward. And then my view is that we'll have a decade of adjustment of the European financial system, and it will be very different when this crisis, if and when this crisis is eventually resolved, from what it was at the beginning of the crisis. And there is already a lot of restructuring that is happening, partly under the radar. Banks selling assets, buying some other assets, new entrants in some market segments, and constant regulatory change. There is this interplay between fragmentation and integration of the European financial space, which is still an undecided outcome in a way, because there are powerful trends towards integration, such as the banking union, powerful trends towards fragmentation, such as what we see in terms of financial repression in some individual member states, and it's not clear what will prevail in terms of the outcome. So there will be a lot of banking consolidation. In many cases, this consolidation is delayed by nationalization, like it has been the case in Korea and in other countries after the Asian financial crisis. But many governments will want to exit from ownership of banks as soon as the market conditions allow. I think the United Kingdom is a good example of that. But in many member states, there is already a very high level of concentration of the banking sector at the national level. So a crucial question for this consolidation to come is how much of it will be cross-border consolidation. And of course, this depends tremendously on the policy frameworks that will exist at the time this consolidation takes place. There is also a big question of whether new players will be allowed to enter the banking market, either entirely new banks, which is not impossible, but also new shareholders for existing banks, especially in terms of private equity funds that could contribute to a reshaping of the industry. And here again, I think Europe will experience a lot of the policy controversies and policy choices that are familiar in Korea or in Japan or in other countries which have gone through the Asian financial crisis or the turmoil of the 1990s. But an equally important factor, I think, is the need for a tremendous increase of non-bank credit intermediation. The banks will deleverage. It will be a long phase of bank deleveraging, and in the meantime, the European economies will need credit. So it will have to come from non-banks or through disintermediated channels. And this is particularly the case as Europe is increasingly a service economy. Companies that grow don't have assets that they can pledge as collateral, and so they need some new forms of financing which European banks may not be best placed to offer. But the risk is that this need and demand for non-bank credit intermediation is repressed by policymakers. There is a lot of discussion, of course, of shadow banking, and under the guise of the legitimate guise of fighting the possible moral hazard created by the expansion of shadow banking, there is a need of having too much policy repression of new forms of credit intermediation. So I think this is a very important space to watch in the future evolution of the European banking system and financial system. In terms of the fiscal union, I suspect that this is a space that has been more discussed perhaps in previous presentations you have attended, either in this format or in other conferences. So I will be much briefer here. Let me just say that there is no clear direction yet in terms of what the shape of the future European fiscal union will take. Everybody talks about fiscal union, but nobody agrees on what exactly is meant here. One possible direction is to have mutual guarantees and some common discipline. Another possibility is to have a central guarantee of the system where individual member states are submitted to a restructuring mechanism by the center when things go wrong. So this is a bit like the idea of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that was broached at the international level a few years ago. Or we could have genuine fiscal federalism, where you have a strong center like in the US, like to a large extent in Canada, in Germany, where you have a strong center with an autonomous fiscal capability, which means the ability to raise taxes, of course, but the individual federated entities, the member states, in the case of the Eurozone, are left to their own devices. They're not under a central guarantee, like is the case in the US. But there is no clear direction which of those three options or another option the fiscal union may take. So at this point everything is very much in flux. We have created instruments, the European Financial Stability Facility in 2010, which is a borrowing facility depending on national guarantees of individual Eurozone member states. The European Stability Mechanism established earlier this month, which is a stronger construct. It's treaty-based, it has paid-in capital, but as I mentioned, it is limited in size and its decision-making is also very clumsy. So it remains to be seen whether the ESM can be considered the embryo of a future European fiscal system, or whether it will remain an ad hoc temporary response to the current crisis. And of course, there are many lessons to be drawn from other experiences of fiscal federalism, including in the US, but I won't expand too much on this for lack of time. On structural reform and competitiveness, let me just say that most of the instruments, if you look at the main issues that are relevant to many European member states in terms of structural reform, many of the instruments are at the national or even at the sub-national local level. So the European Union is not the only level that matters. If you think of labor mobility, flexibility, fairness, and also welfare reform, this is entirely or almost entirely national. The question is how much coordination is necessary in the future. The financial system is also a matter of structural reform, as I mentioned. Where does equity investment and credit provision comes from? Here the European level has more of a role to play in connection with all the discussion around banking union and stability policy. Insolvency law is entirely national right now in Europe, but it's a very important element of structural policy. So I think we need more debate on this in terms of how a more modern, in a way, insolvency legislation could help European companies to grow more than is currently the case. Competition policy is a federal policy in Europe, but implementation remains to a large extent at the national level. So here some discussion is needed also in terms of the effectiveness of competition policy and whether it goes far enough, echoing perhaps some debates you have in this country at the moment. Regulation of individual industries and professions is something where a lot of progress is needed. There is a tremendous amount of red tape and regulations that don't maximize the potential for growth in many European countries, not only in the south, by the way. This also applies to Germany and to some northern European countries. So that's a big area for structural reform and policy coordination. And also, of course, innovation policy, research, development, innovation ecosystems, and the corresponding reforms in education, but this is more of a local level policy. So the big question that is overarching on all these areas is how much coordination is needed at the European level? Can we just rely on benchmarking and peer pressure, or do we need something stronger? The Lisbon Agenda or Agenda 2020 were past initiatives of the European Union which were not very successful in trying to create a race to the top through peer pressure in those structural reform areas. So I think we're still at the beginning of what is likely to be a long learning curve by governments of member states and the European institutions on what exactly needs to be coordinated. If you think, for example, about retirement frameworks and pension frameworks in Europe, the connection with the fiscal policy is actually very important. Right now you have Germans, for example, who say, why should we retire at age 67 and pay for the retirement system of Greece, where people retire at age 60 or 62? So it's difficult to know exactly which of these structural policies will be brought into the European level of discussion as opposed to national level as things develop in terms of crisis management and resolution. Finally, but not least, the challenges of political and institutional settings in the European Union. The core challenge, as I have already said, is a challenge of representation and accountability, in my view, because it is often in the context of Europe, there is often a reference to a democratic deficit, that the European institutions are not democratic enough. But actually, what we have seen in the crisis, and I would say what we have discovered in the crisis, is that there is an equally important deficit, which is an executive deficit. The fact that the European level of policy making is not well equipped to make the right decisions at the right time. So there has been policy paralysis and a lack of executive capability, which you see, of course, in national environments. I would say that, for example, the US and Japan particularly come to mind at the current juncture as two countries where particularly in the fiscal area, there is some degree of consensus on what is to be done, but no ability to act. But I think that the European Union has brought this executive deficit to an extreme point, and this becomes not only a problem of the quality of the leadership, but also a problem of our institutions. There is a very interesting ruling of the German Constitutional Court on the Lisbon Treaty, which was delivered a bit more than 3 years ago, in June 2009, where they analyze this situation, institutional situation, in the context of the adoption of this new European treaty. And they make the point, which I think is very well taken, that the European Parliament suffers not only from limited powers, but also from an inequality of representation, because the citizens of some member states are much better represented by factors that can vary from 1 to 10 than the citizens of other member states, which is part of the compromises that have been made in the past between smaller and larger member states in the European Union. But they make this, I think, very pointed analysis that because of this, the European Parliament cannot support a parliamentary government and organize itself with regard to party politics in the system of government and opposition in such a way that a decision on political direction taken by the European electorate could have a politically decisive effect, which in a way is a definition of democracy. So rightly, I believe, the Constitutional Court describes this situation as a structural democratic deficit, which is part of the problems that have become very visible in the context of the Eurozone crisis. So my view, and here I echo what many commentators but also policymakers have been increasingly saying in the past few months, is that these questions of European institutions actually have to be considered fully part of the crisis resolution framework. If you don't address them, it is unlikely that we can successfully address the overall crisis that is at hand. Of course, there are issues of timetable here, and we know that treaty revisions are very difficult, but it's part of the overall landscape of challenges. And there are very diverse attitudes among the member states in terms of more political integration and a more federal political setting for the European Union. Some countries like Germany and Italy, for example, are fairly comfortable with the federal principles. Their own institutions are largely organized along the idea of a political federation. So it's not an impossible step for them to envisage. Other countries, such as particularly France, and I would argue to a large extent also Spain, are much more reluctant. So there are very different attitudes depending on which member states you're talking about. And of course, there is always never very far the question of the United Kingdom, which is a huge question mark on the future of the European Union, which will be determined primarily by UK politics. But will the United Kingdom stay or not in the European Union? What attitude will it take to further integration by other member states? And I don't think we have any answer to this question right now. It will be of determining importance for the future. So what we have in the meantime is a lot of political volatility. We see abrupt shifts in partisan alignments, like we saw, for example, but this is only one of several examples in the recent Dutch election, where the polls were completely wrong on determining who would win. In that case, the polls were saying the extremes would win, and in the end, the centrist parties won. So it's not always the case that the extremes are gaining strength. Actually, it's a much more complex picture in the current European politics. We also see abrupt shifts in the political political economy of individual member states. One example that struck me as a French citizen is what happened with the attitude this year of the French government vis-à-vis banking unions. At the beginning of the year, the French government was very reluctant vis-à-vis the idea of a banking union and a much more integrated policy framework for banking policy. And somewhere in the spring, they have become a big champion of this, which to many observers and particularly to me was very unexpected. So we have these volatilities, these very quick shifts that make it much more difficult to predict how political systems will react to future developments of the crisis. And now, which also has come as a surprise to me, is the possible rise of separatism, particularly the case of Catalonia in Spain, which I think is a very significant development from a political perspective and might change once again to a significant degree the equation about policy reform. So to conclude, what are the next steps? The economic outlook, as you know, is not good. The contraction in the European periphery is almost continuously becoming worse and worse. There are some qualifications to this. The export performance of Spain and Portugal in particular has been fairly strong in the past few months, but still there is no clear indication that there will be a successful rebalancing of the periphery countries and of the European economy. So the redenomination risk, which is to say the risk of a Eurozone breakup, remains there, even so it's perhaps more distant prospect than people thought in the spring. The banking union will be a very difficult and bumpy path for European decision maker. We'll see what legislative compromise is found, hopefully before the end of this year. But what it will be even more contentious is to determine the modalities of intervention by the European Stability Mechanism once the possibility of such intervention is unlocked. Some countries will remain hotspots. Of course, Spain may ask for a new assistance program in the next few weeks. I think it's actually likely, but will remain a very complicated situation, both politically and economically and financially in terms of the banking system. Greece is now given the benefit of the doubt, but it's not clear that it will be on track even of a very significantly revised adjustment program. So I think we'll continue to have a lot of uncertainty and disruptive risk coming from Greece, particularly in 2013. And then there is a possibility of a worsening of the situation, both in terms of the economy, the financial system, but also the politics in Italy and France. So as you can see, I don't paint a fully optimistic picture. I think there are many accidents that may happen in the next year. Or 2 years. I don't think any accident will happen in the next few weeks, but if you take a bit of a longer view, we're far from being out of the woods in spite of the recent improvement in market conditions. And as I have argued, the crisis can probably not be resolved without one or several changes in the treaty, and this is an extremely risky and contentious process. The discussion has not really started, and of course there is a difficulty of negotiating new treaty arrangements, but also the risk of them not being ratified by all member states, and as you know, we have a rule of unanimity for such things in the European Union. So what is the overall outlook for the Eurozone? Some very insightful experts have predicted the breakup of the Eurozone. It hasn't happened yet. Other insightful experts have said the Eurozone will never break up and it's here to stay. I'm less insightful. I don't know. I think there are some very credible scenarios of breakup which might happen. It will depend on the decisions that are made by the leaders and the citizens of European countries going forward. I think it really depends on your views on cultural or historical determinism. There is a school of thought, particularly in the UK, but also in other places, which says the whole endeavor of creating a single currency was bound to fail because these are different countries. They will never, you will never transform the Greeks into Germans and vice versa. So it cannot work. So the argument is that culturally and historically and also linguistically, the European Union or the Eurozone are too diverse to have the sort of political and policy integration which I have described as the necessary condition for successful crisis management. And I think we simply don't know the answer, because my view of this is that what is being attempted in the Eurozone is to a large extent unprecedented in terms of political integration dynamics. But if you take a hard look at the argument on diversity, it actually isn't very convincing, because if you look at countries like, say, Canada, or to an even greater extent, India, you can have a lot of linguistic, historical, also religious and ethnic diversity, and have functioning democratic systems. You have tensions, of course, but they have proved to be manageable. And so the very idea that the Eurozone or the European Union is simply too diverse to have a political system of organizations that would work, I think is very backward-looking, thinks that things will be the same in the future as they have been in the past, and as we know, this is not the best way to think about history. So I would be much less deterministic. I don't know whether the Eurozone will survive. I know for sure that it will be if it survives, it will be very different from the organization we knew before the crisis. So the crisis is transformational in any scenario, but I think we will still have surprises along that way, and I don't know in which direction. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to a more interactive discussion now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for very comprehensive coverage of European scene today. Now, with this, any questions or comments? It's a good opportunity.
Thank you very much for your deep-sighted the introduction and explanation of the present situation in EU. As Korean ambassador to the OECD, I visited Brussels quite often. And then in Brussels Parliament, they have 27 countries, but they have 24 different languages. So it takes many minutes to communicate each other. If somebody speaks in his own or in his or her own language a joke, then it is interpreted in major language, English, German, French, Spanish, Italian. And then it is translated again to Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovenia. So it is so difficult looking at the very complicated structure. And looking at the experience of Belgium, I know that for almost a year there was no government, because you cannot get the consensus among different parties representing Dutch-speaking area and French-speaking area. So when it comes to political issues, politicians represent the interest of each his or her own constituency. So it is so difficult to make a complete agreement. Even within this country, speaking the same language, it's very difficult. And in the States, we see even after the election, there might be kind of a fiscal cliff, because it's not easy to make an agreement between Democratic and Republican Party. So in that sense, I wonder whether the monetary system, euro, can sustainable. And especially looking at Greece situation, there is no possibility for them pay back their own debt by the money which they owned, because their industry is so less competitive, and there is no mechanism for them to change it by they don't have their own currency. So that means Germany and Northern European countries, not a couple of years, for many, many years, even decades, should cooperate by restructuring or giving subsidy. So what is your personal prediction? Greece can stay in the system. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't I invite a couple more, and yes, and Dr. Kim.
Actually, I was going to wait until the last because the question really is the last question. But since Ambassador Kwon pointed out this issue, I would like to address. I was really struck by your comment, Mr. Vernon, when you said you were not sure whether European Union's future can stay as is or disintegrate. It's one of the more, I guess, candid statements I heard. All the analysis on Europe is how to solve the crisis as we face, and we go happily thereafter. But I have an ultimate question, which is more philosophical. I think the concept of European Union, really germinated at the time when the United States appeared like the haven on earth. And the Europeans more or less patterned after, if we can do half as well as the U.S. does, one currency, one union, etc., we'll be really live happily hereafter. Now, with increasing complexity of the world today, and as we know, all the developed countries have to, by nature, slow down in growth. What appeared to be such an easy, beautiful model of the U.S. post-World War II is no longer the heaven on earth. Now, there is not enough question discussed, I think, and I'd like to ask you, if there are people in the European Union thinking really, if we miraculously save through all those 4 layers of problems, banking, fiscal, economic, and political, what would Europe look like? Is that the happy answer? Can we sustain? And that's how you probably mentioned you are not sure whether EU can stay. The problem is really related to what Ambassador Kwon mentioned. You mentioned a very interesting example of India as counter-argument to the diversity alone is not a convincing argument. But let's not forget, India went through 100 years of British rule where they were enforced on certain amount of uniformity, including English as a language. Yeah, of course, if we have hundreds of years and if somebody, dictator, took over Europe, I'm sure 300 years from now, you can be a functioning united Europe. But we are not going to think about that. So the fundamental question is this union, so diverse. And by the way, India still has one religion, more or less. Hindu rules. But if you have 27 European Union, we have everything. So the telling story was, as a student, when we learned the economics, if an economy suffers, its currency weakens. So what happens in 2008 in U.S. has economic crisis? Dollar strengthened and the euro weakened. That's the telling story about how that euro will be viewed without sovereign state. So I think the fundamental issue has to be more thought about. I mean, obviously, crises have to be taken care of, but when you take care of those crises, is there an end of the tunnel?
Many questions. I will try to give answers to the different aspects quickly, but I will not give them really justice because they are very big questions. As to what Ambassador Kwon said about diversity and political effectiveness, I think the examples you gave shows that there is, in a way, there is no reference political systems that works smoothly at this point. You look at the U.S., you look at Belgium, you look at Japan, you look at China. I mean, who knows what the leadership change will bring. So we don't really have a model. And I don't think there is a perfect model, and we can see that perhaps because of technology, because of globalization, some old forms of thinking about the nation state and national government are increasingly challenged in the world we live in. It is a way, I think not an inaccurate way of looking at the whole enterprise of European integration as a response to globalization. I've quoted Jean Monnet at the beginning of my presentation. and actually as early as 1955, I think, he described European integration as the fact that European countries were too small for today's world, and there is a need to have something that is commensurate with the scale brought by modern technology and the scale, as he framed it at the time, of the United States and the Soviet Union today, China and India tomorrow, 1955. So I think this vision was there from the beginning, but it doesn't mean that we have a workable arrangement. The reason I mentioned India is clearly not to say that the process in Europe will be similar to the process in India. Each part of the world has a different history. You mentioned British colonization. It is important to understand India today. That is an understatement. My point was a more limited one, to say just the degree of diversity we have in the Eurozone right now. So the degree of, again, linguistical, historical diversity is not per se an obstacle to the existence of an integrated framework of political organization. And what forms this framework will take will certainly have to be different from anything that currently exists, if you look particularly at the details, but there is no logical impossibility, because there are many indicators along which India today is much more diverse than the Eurozone or the European Union, and I'm not even mentioning caste. You asked the question of whether Greece would be able to repay its debt, and here my clear answer is no. I think any reasonable analysis of the Greek debt suggests that the debt will not be repaid under the current contractual arrangement. So there will be a need for change in those arrangements, and the big question, of course, is will this change be negotiated or will it be unilateral? Now, as you know, most of the debt owed by the Greek government is to official sector creditors. There is some remaining private sector debt, but the big part of the equation is those official sector held debt. And here it is clear to me that there will be what the current jargon calls an official sector involvement at some point in the future. The question is, what form will it take? It could be a very negotiated and sort of a fudge in which the official sector accepts a rescheduling, no coupon, a very long maturity, very low interest rate, big economic loss, but everybody saves face. And frankly, I think this remains a reference scenario in case Greece would stay in the Eurozone. Of course, there is a more disruptive scenario in which the Greek government is increasingly unable to deliver on any of its commitments, including tax collection, which remains the most basic challenge they have and hasn't been properly addressed yet. But if there is an orderly way out of the current situation, I think we'll have this sort of rescheduling. So my reference scenario would remain one where Greece will not repay the debt as we currently see it, but it would be negotiated and Greece would be able to stay in the Eurozone. The thing that I'm sure you've already heard 100 times from European visitors, but remains true, is that Greece is 2% of the economy of the Eurozone. It's not a big economy in the larger scheme of things. So if it's just about subsidizing Greece, the Eurozone can afford that. What it cannot afford is a precedent that would apply to other parts of the geographical area. And this is why the political management of this situation is also so important. I believe the visit to Greece by Angela Merkel, when was that, 2 weeks ago or so, was extremely important symbolically and politically. I take it as a genuine political commitment, and I think it is something new, which I suspect has been taken as such also by a number of international investors. Dr. Kim, you mentioned that I gave a candid presentation. It's easy for me. I'm not a policymaker, right? So I have an advantage of working in two very independent organizations, the Peterson Institute and Bruegel, which gives me a freedom of speech that policymakers cannot afford. But I think our policymakers in Europe have made a lot of progress in their own candor, at least in terms of analysis of the crisis in the past 6 months. And this makes me mildly optimistic, because I think if you look at the situation now compared to 6 months ago, and I'm not talking only about the breakthrough on banking union, but also about this larger framework that the late June paper by Herman Van Rompuy exemplified, thinking about political challenges, thinking about the interplay between structural challenges, financial challenges, and fiscal challenges. Of course, we don't have a consensus, and we will never have one, and some politicians, if I may speak so, still don't get it. But I think, in general, there is a lot of learning going on in the European policy community. And a lot of the analytical mistakes that were made at the beginning of the crisis have been, to a certain extent, overcome. So it's way too slow, of course, and there is a race between the deterioration of economic and financial conditions and this learning curve. But I think the learning curve takes place, which is a mildly positive thing to acknowledge. You asked this philosophical question or deeply political question of whether the US can still be a model in the current world, and B, whether there is a stable, steady state arrangement for a more integrated Europe. Of course, these are very big questions that I don't feel able to answer. Let me say something which applies both to the US and to Europe, I think, and which is about flexibility and adaptability. I think the beauty of the US Constitution is that it has been able to allow for reinvention of the nature of the US government time and again. You look at the US government today and the US government 200 years ago or 100 years ago after the Civil War, but before the New Deal, and you have three very different forms of political organization for this continent-sized economy. And I don't know the future of the US, but I think the potential for adaptability and reinvention in the US institutional setting is actually not yet exhausted. And when I look at Europe, I think there is also an element of adaptability, and there are some federal policies that have proven fairly stable, even more stable than perhaps should have been predicted. You look at competition policy, for example. At this point, nobody questions the fact that Brussels can veto a merger or force a company to divest some assets, etc. These are fairly strong political powers. I take the example of competition policy because this, I think, has really now become a matter to a large degree of consensus across member states, even those member states which have a lot of temptation of economic nationalism and protectionism, like my own home country, France. Nobody really questions the authority of Brussels in competition policy. So it's possible on individual policy areas to build that sort of authority on a way which is stable and sustainable. So the big question, of course, is can we do it for policy areas which are much bigger than competition policy, such as fiscal policy and banking policy. And this is why I think the political institutions of Europe have to change with this much stronger element of democratic representation and accountability. But I think it's institutional innovation. We're talking about trying new forms of organization. The fact that it's innovation means it's not guaranteed to succeed, but it also is not guaranteed to fail. So I'm really not deterministic once again here. I think the last part of your question was about the euro, the strength of the euro as a currency in the international environment, and you mentioned that weaker economies generally should have weaker currencies, and in a way the resilience of the euro, even so it has been a bit down from its peak, continues to surprise me, including as somebody who have to make some very practical decisions being paid partly in euros and partly in US dollars at Bruegel and at the Peterson Institute. I think the dollar-euro parity is not a good indicator of neither the strength of the European economy or the Eurozone economy or the developments in the Eurozone crisis, because the euro itself is part of the question. And let me explain what I mean by this. If Greece exits the Eurozone, or if the Eurozone breaks up, investors who hold euros probably, at least in some breakup scenarios, would end up having the German currency, or the currency of what remains of the core, rather than the currency of the periphery. So actually there is a bit of a complex element here, which means that the bigger the possibility of the breakup, the stronger the currency you have in hand if you hold euros. And I think this has made it very difficult to, this single factor has made it very difficult to interpret the euro-dollar exchange rate in the past few years.
Thank you for your presentation. I noted the UK on one of the charts. Now, if it were to come into the Union completely, what would be the positives and negatives?
I think many observers have tended to see the UK question and the Eurozone crisis as two separate developments, right? There is a UK debate about the European Union, and it's very inward-looking, and you have all these Tory backbenchers and a debate which is very internal to the United Kingdom on the one hand, and then there is the Eurozone saga. Obviously, they're linked, and one link is that if the Eurozone integrates, the UK at this point is not willing to join, and therefore it will increase the distance between the UK and a large part of the rest of the European Union. The other link is the other way around. If we have increasingly a decision-making process where the UK is not part of it, how will it affect the decision-making process? So it's another way of asking what is the role of the UK in today's or yesterday's European Union, and how different would be the Union without the UK, and I would argue the Union would be very different without the UK. So the UK has made it very clear that it would not join the banking union. As far as I know, it's the only non-Eurozone member state that has made it that clear. The other ones, including Sweden, Denmark, Poland, etc., are still at the point where they haven't made up their mind about banking union membership. And actually it's a big part of the current negotiation, how far the geographical perimeter can extend beyond the Eurozone countries. My view of the stance of the current UK government, which I think is a big change of direction compared to previous governments, so the fact that they now favor further European integration but without the UK in, is that it doesn't, I mean, if I were a UK citizen, I would not consider it best suited to the UK national interest. Now, I'm not a UK citizen, so who am I to make a judgment? But I'm not sure all the long-term consequences of this stance have been carefully weighed by the current team. And I think it's, it's a historical process. It will have consequences for the long-term future of the UK. Right now, I see absolutely no prospect of the UK joining further integration of Europe. Even so, I could see an economic and financial and historical rationale for this, but I don't think it's going to happen. Because not only the current government, but I suspect public opinion, and you can relate this to the media and Mr. Murdoch and all that, and many other influences that permeate UK society. The UK is a very Eurosceptic country. They don't like the European integration, they don't want to be part of it, they don't see it as a successful process. So it's not going to happen unless there is a huge transformation of the UK, which I don't see in the immediate future. So, if there is a secession of Scotland and a deep recession in the UK, etc., I mean, maybe you have a different equation. But at this point, if the UK remains reasonably stable, I don't think this stance will change. So then the question becomes, what does that mean for the rest of the European Union? And what does that mean in particular for the European financial system, the role of London as a financial hub of Europe? And honestly, I don't know the answers. I think that the UK has often been a voice for liberal positions in European Union decision-making. But in a way, this voice was needed. So if the UK is no longer there, others, I think, will take it. So I'm not sure one can say with certainty that the European Union policymaking will become less liberal necessarily as a consequence, because I think it's a more subtle balance than that. And in terms of the relationship with the US, I don't think the UK is central to the relationship with the US the way it used to be in the past. So I don't know. Very difficult question to answer. I think the UK question is actually a central question for the future of Europe. I feel much more strongly about this than many of the continental European commentators. But ultimately, it will be decided by the UK political process and not by the rest of Europe. And at this point, it doesn't seem to be oriented towards more integration.
Because it's got its own problem.
Yeah, and everybody has problems right now. So maybe less so in Sweden, but even Sweden has problems. So what I think is difficult to say is whether those problems might lead some years from now to a change of attitude vis-à-vis European integration. And at this point, I don't see it happening.
As you pointed out, everybody has problem now. I have a sister who lives in Finland right now. And I'm struck by some comments she made about it. It's a country which, one of the Nordics, very successful countries, high standard of living. They were very happy, very, very accommodating with racial integrations, etc. The atmosphere these days is extremely ugly.
Yeah.
Very, very anti-foreign. And this is happening everywhere. And Germans are against the Turks, and all those kind of things happening. You mentioned the Greek is only 2% of EU. I mean, of course, what economic value or military value it can contribute or not contribute is infinitesimal. But that's not the issue. The issue is that diversity and the problem is very endemic throughout the entire Europe. In fact, more successful countries are now disenchanted with the euro. Netherlands, Germans. And the last 2 years, I've read more criticism about Angela Merkel than anything else in the European leaders. But if you really look inside of it, she has been the more ardent supporter of the EU than the entire German population combined together, I think. And she has been very skillfully maneuvering her political life with the electorate, which is not supporting it, but she wanted to support Europe. That's my feeling, which indicates that there is a fundamental issue of difficulties now. People throughout all those four dimensions we're talking about banking, finance, and the economic, political. What is not discussed is a cultural difference, ethnic cultural difference, which is very, very difficult to overcome. You mentioned Canada as a success case, but I would point out as an indication of 200 years later, they still have some movement of independent French-Canadian sentiment still existing. Very, very different from the United States. And even India, which is imposed by British colonialism, they are stuck with this one English ruling country. I cannot envision that in the next 300 years happening in Europe. This is my problem. It's not whether spinning off Greece or spinning off even Italy and Spain is the issue. Ultimately, can the diversity be ruled as one nation? In the United States now is having enough problems. I have seen more antagonism within the bipolarization, politics, and etc. in the United States I have ever seen. Going from the other end to that unification, I think we probably have to find a better paradigm of solution than unification.
Okay, with that, okay, yes.
I realized that I also forgot to answer to Ambassador Kwan's remark about the European Parliament and the fact that each was speaking their own language. I think actually English has made enormous progress in the EU in the past few decades. And I say that with pleasure, even as a French citizen, because I think that English is now very established as a common working language for the entire EU policymaking community in a way that wasn't the case as recently as, say, 15 years ago. And in the European Parliament, of course, when there is a plenary session, they make this, slightly funny translation gymnastics. But in committee work, everybody speaks English, and some speak better English than others, and this is to be suspected. I mean, in the national parliament, I am sure this is the case in Korea. Some parliamentarians speak very good Korean, and some are less eloquent. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but I think you cannot expect, and I suspect the same is even more true in India. Even so, I'm less familiar with the Indian lower chamber. I'm sure that some of the members, irrespective of their criminal record, have more or less ability to speak in English than others. The difficulties are obvious, and I think what you said about the surge in, inward-looking attitudes, ethnic nationalism, etc. This is true in Europe. It's true in other parts of the world. It's part of. You can see it as part of a backlash against globalization. It's a complex phenomenon, but it's to be taken very seriously. I would qualify what you said about Germany and Mrs. Merkel, because it's not clear to me that there is more anti-foreigner sentiment in Germany than there used to be right now. And I speak under the control of the German at the table. It's also not clear to me that within the German political spectrum, Mrs. Merkel has been the most ardent advocate of European integration. You might be right in saying she has been the most skillful and shrewd advocate, but perhaps not the most ardent. Actually, if you look at the Social Democrats and the Greens, they have often criticized her for not being generous enough with Greece and not being proactive enough with European integration. But I agree with you on the substance, which is that she has managed this set of political constraints very well. And I think this is best illustrated perhaps by the applause she received about a week ago at the Congress of the Bavarian component of her coalition, the CSU, which tends to be more Eurosceptic than most other parts of the coalition, and has endorsed her European policy stance in a very comprehensive way. So, I mean, because your question is so important, will the centrifugal forces prevail, or will the forces of integration prevail in the future of Europe? And I guess we could ask in the future of the world. I obviously don't have an answer to this question. I see the centrifugal forces as you see them. I also see the forces of integration. Let me be slightly utopian for a second. You mentioned prominently the question of linguistic diversity. It is perfectly possible that in 10 or 15 years' time, which is a very short time by historical standards, this whole question in terms of the pure language element of it, I'm not talking about culture, but in terms of language, will be actually made obsolete by the progress in software. And this is not a utopian statement, because when you look at what translation software is achieving now, it's just breathtaking compared with what it was just 5 or 10 years ago. So, of course, linguistic unification or the abolition of language barriers doesn't mean the abolition of cultural and historical barriers, and I wouldn't be that naive. So that might actually leave all the centrifugal forces intact as you have described them. But it's also a way to say that there are also forces of integration that we should not underestimate, and we don't know the ultimate outcome.
Okay, I think we can go on like this all morning, this morning. But I think based on the discussion so far, what one can summarize it. There are a lot of uncertainties, but the word modeling through may be the best way to describe the near future of the Eurozone. You know, Eurozone started with the steel and coal union, and the main purpose was more political than economic, and so far it has been quite successful in preventing another war. So if I were in Chancellor Merkel's or the Hollande's shoes, I don't think I want to go down history as the stupid leader who broke European Union, the endeavor, which was initiated and supported by all their predecessors and the visionaries. So I think I may go on, but in the short-term crisis situation, maybe I think the U.S. economic recovery and what's going to happen to the China would again be affected, because that will affect the European economy from the cyclical perspective. In any case, Greek's problem is different, but Eurozone is, as a whole may go on at least in foreseeable future. Well, that's the way I see it, and based on our discussions here, again, we reconfirm this belief, at least to me. Well, with this, we have to end here, and you are the top 10 thinkers of our time, and we're really happy to have you, and he has a very packed schedule going to Hong Kong and India and all over the places in Asia. Have a nice trip and safe trip. Thank you very much.